Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping build the AI-driven newsrooms of the future. And I am thrilled today to welcome to the podcast David Caswell. David has been working with machine learning and AI for well over a decade, leading news product innovation at the BBC, Tribune Publishing, and Yahoo. He's now a consultant, builder, and researcher focused on AI in news and computational journalism. I can't think of anyone better qualified to talk to about AI and news than this man. Welcome to the Media Copilot, David.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Well, sir, I just really want to get right into it. So Last fall, you wrote an article called AI in News, What's Next? And I would describe this article as really definitive. By the way, I'll link this in the show notes for anyone curious. But what you did, and this was, I think, last September, you really laid out like what I would describe as essentially a manual for any news organization to navigate this brave new world where generative AI is existing in a universe alongside newsrooms. So, can you articulate what you were trying to achieve with that piece and what the subsequent feedback you've gotten since it was published?
Sure. What I was trying to do was to take a lot of the kind of the framework that I developed around how to think about AI in news over the years, and that goes back 10 years or more to my time at Yahoo. But a lot of it is also kind of ways I've developed of thinking about this over the last year and a half, as ChatGPT and other AI tools have really kind of dominated our conversation. And also, as I've interacted with newsrooms and leaders in newsrooms around how to apply these tools and what people were doing in different size newsrooms in different ways. And so what the article was trying to do essentially is kind of capture that. I kind of wrote it for myself, really, to get down on paper this kind of framework for how I was thinking about these things. And so a lot of it deals with the options that are available to newsrooms, options in terms of different strategies, options in terms of specific projects to begin an AI journey in news, options in terms of the infrastructure that's both increasingly kind of required to take advantage of these tools, options in terms of organizational structure and so on. And that's what the article does. So it's basically like a guide, I guess, to sort of the space of possibility at this stage. I think already, we're now about 6 months later. I think it's already a little dated.
I was just going to ask.
But at the time, it's that was kind of where I'd got to and how to think about these tools.
So you mentioned it's a little dated. That was actually going to be my follow-up question. So what needs updating? What has changed since you wrote that piece?
Well, I think there's a little bit of nuance here. So the main thing that's changed since I wrote that piece, and I allude to this a little bit in the piece, is that I think people are becoming more aware that AI is not just about making the existing workflows and products and sort of competitive situation of news organizations more efficient. That's a logical place to start. That's what a lot of that article talks about. But I think what's happening is bigger than that and broader than that, and the implications are deeper than that. And I think that's one of the things that conversation around, well, what is going to be fundamentally different about the information ecosystem and about the place of journalism in that ecosystem, and how is that going to kind of shape how journalism develops with generative search, conversational news experiences, the ability of basically anybody to access these media creating tools. When you kind of bring all that together, what does the information environment in which all that exists, what does that look like? And what's news, what's the place of news in that? So I think that's a much bigger part of the conversation now. So it's a bigger part of the work that I'm doing in various ways, is trying to kind of figure that out and kind of plot for that. And then the other aspect is what are the strategies that news organizations can pursue that take advantage of those kind of near term efficiency based things, the things that are very easy to understand, the very tactical kind of the quote unquote low hanging fruit of AI. How do you develop a strategy that takes advantage of those, but also gives you a path to the flexibility and the options that you need as an organization to deal with this longer term change?
Yeah, I like what you said there about the various things with generative search and the wide accessibility of AI, and that the simply applying AI to our current news environment or how things have always been done is just such an inadequate vision. So clearly, with the whole ecosystem changing, and I want to key in on one of those things, which is the sort of democratization that everyone has this technology now, and it seems like there is a corollary with the internet where suddenly everyone could be their own journalist, and bloggers sort of rose to fame, and then social media was a whole different thing. Now with generative AI, like I think the example I would point to that comes out most prominently in my mind for some reason is, remember the whole SEO heist guy that this is a thing last fall, and someone was able to basically create a website with tons and tons of articles created by generative AI to essentially create a media site overnight, and that could steal that traffic from quote unquote real media sites supposedly. And that's just one example of how this environment is changing, where journalists used to have to contend with bloggers and influencers, but now they have to contend with everyone who is savvy about this technology and leveraging it in a way that can just completely upend the formula, like the audience and how everything works. I don't know, like how do you I'm not sure what my question is here. Like, how do we deal with that?
I mean, it's. I think it's getting to the heart of one of the fundamental challenges that news organizations are going to face. I mean, what these tools do, and I'm talking mostly about large language models here. What these tools do is they separate the semantic information, the news information, the sort of the facts, the arguments, the tone, all of that stuff. They separate that from the way that that's communicated. And so it used to be that these things were bound together, and they were bound in an article or in a podcast or in a video, whatever it was. But now they're not. And so the ability, like in a simple way, to just paraphrase an article is new.
Right.
So this is kind of what you're talking about with the SEO, bro. Paraphrasing, looking at what somebody's doing, stealing the information through paraphrasing automatically, and then kind of doing things with that to get traffic. But it goes so much further than this. I mean, if you look at generative search, for example, Google's generative search experience is a good one. These are essentially doing the same thing, but they're not doing it with a single article. They're taking a question, some kind of search question, and they're extracting information from multiple articles, or even multiple articles and multiple videos, and then they're bringing that information into a very, very focused response to that question. The same thing is true with conversational interfaces. You might have an interaction with ChatGPT in text, or you might even have it in voice. There's tools from Inflection AI, for example, that let you do this partially in voice. That conversation is being informed by documents, lots of different text documents and video documents and whatever the sources are, and that's all coming together to this experience. And so all of these examples, the fundamental thing they're doing is they're separating the information from the way that is created. The act or the artifact of communicating the information is a lot less valuable now because we have machines that can do it. But the information itself, that's still as valuable as it ever was. How do you protect it is the question I think we're all going to be, or how do you get paid for producing it, I think is the question we're all going to be struggling with for a while.
Yeah, and it's definitely ongoing. So I think that naturally sort of leads to what I wanted to get into with you, which is I think what you're getting at is the heart of the lawsuit that the New York Times has laid against OpenAI, with this idea of a transformative take on whatever the information they have and sort of serving them up in a different way. But I mean that is ultimately, I feel like what has happened here is for the longest time there seemed to be a de facto agreement between big tech platforms and the media, which is to say, okay, you can index our content and we will get traffic in return that serves our business model. And that, that has not turned out exactly hunky dory for the media, but that was essentially it. And now it looks like with generative search, the second part of that, getting the traffic, is now gone, right? And so like they're kind of reneging on that. So we need a new model. And what seems to be emerging with some of the deals that OpenAI is making, oh, we'll pay you essentially not to sue us for doing this transformative thing with your content. And the New York Times is the one sort of standing up saying, I don't like the deal or I don't like that whole idea. And I just really would love to get sort of your take on it. Like how important is this to get a resolution in this lawsuit, and sort of ultimately whatever happens with it, what do you think, how do you think this shakes out?
Well, in general, I think this sort of collapse in referral traffic that's happening, I think that's happening because of reasons other than AI. It
Right.
began earlier than the
Definitely.
whole ChatGPT moment. Generative search is a relatively small portion of search right now. So I think this was going to happen. This kind of post-social or post-referral situation was going to happen anyways. So that's worth keeping in mind. And then you have the potential of generative search, conversational interfaces, and so on to make that vastly worse, although it's already pretty bad. In terms of kind of how this plays out in the New York Times lawsuit, in reading through that complaint from the New York Times, I think they describe it quite well. I kind of interpret that as having two rather separate arguments for two rather separate audiences. The very narrow legal argument they have, which is essentially that you can recover the verbatim text of an article from
Right.
inside of ChatGPT. I think that's a very weak argument. I think that's a very difficult thing to do. I think it only works for a tiny number of articles, and the reason it works for those articles is because they've already been widely distributed on the internet, and therefore they're overrepresented in the training data. So my take, again, I'm not a lawyer in this, but
Right.
my take is
Big
that that's a
caveat. Neither am I.
it's a relatively weak argument, I think. And there's been some very deliberate work that's been done in the past. Nick Diakopoulos, for example, who's a researcher at Northwestern, has done a bunch of work on this back in August or September, well before the lawsuit, to show how difficult it is to pull the verbatim text out. But there's a second argument in that complaint, and that's a much better argument. I don't think it's a legal argument. I think it's a laying out of the risk that news organizations are facing due to precisely this challenge, which is that, well, if the information, if you can't copyright facts and you can just sort of strip that information out and reuse it and remix it, without some kind of financial transaction, then where does that leave us in terms of paying journalists? And I think they do the industry. I think that's the real concern, frankly.
Yeah. How do you incentivize the gathering of the facts?
Exactly, and so that I think is what they're kind of laying out there. They may get some kind of a settlement from OpenAI, as Associated Press have done and as Axel Springer have done, but I think those kind of deals are probably not going to be open to most news organizations.
I always kind of wonder what happens to the little guy as these big titans, whether it's the New York Times or News Corporation or whomever, right? Like the Guardian, et cetera. Like someone even like myself, right? I'm just a Substacker, and I guess I'm sort of at the mercy of whatever Substack does, and or even just the smaller newsrooms that are already struggling. How
Well,
do they?
I
Yeah.
think there's another dynamic going on here with generative AI or large language models in that, because you look at social or search, and they deal with documents. They deal with links to documents, links to articles, links to videos, and so on. But what the large language model needs is not documents; it's facts, right? It's
Mm.
information. It's semantic information, and you don't need lots and lots of semantic information, like duplicated semantic information. You just need to get some understanding of what that situation is, which you can do from a relatively small number of relatively high quality news organizations. So there may be some model that emerges for maybe local reporting or specialty reporting in niche areas.
Mm.
But by and large, this era where you have 800 people in Iowa, following the primaries and the caucuses there, that era makes no sense in a language model because you don't need 800 documents. You only need one, or
Hmm.
two.
Cool. Switching tracks a little bit. So to another thing that's happened since you published your piece, there was the whole debacle with Sports Illustrated, which was kind of the latest, but I would say sort of probably the most prominent and perhaps the most definitive in terms of a long line of using generative technology to scale up content. Now, I should qualify here: the people who sort of submitted that copy to them, which was a third party, have been on record saying they claim that the content wasn't actually AI generated, although the profiles of the authors were. Again, draw your own conclusions. I think from a cursory look at them, it's kind of hard to believe they're done by humans. But anyway, I still count this as a sort of an incident of where we term it here at the Media Copilot the gray slime era of content. And I wrote a piece that was sort of essentially that the AI is coming from inside the house, which is to say, oh, if you're a bigger organization with syndication deals and freelancers and all this, you kind of really need to account for this in whatever your strategy is. But I would ask you, what do you think the lesson is here, particularly thinking about, yes, journalism. We certainly want to preserve the human part of it, and I think everyone agrees it's essential at this point. But there's a greater world of content where there's just going to be this kind of gray slime coming from other sort of less sites that care less about the human element and more about the simply putting out content at scale. So as that sort of grows in this ecosystem, like what are the lessons from the early era of trying to do generative content at some sort of scale within newsrooms, other than don't do that?
Well, just on the don't do that side, I think it's worthwhile thinking about uh, the use of LLMs in newsrooms in terms of two very different kinds of tasks.
Mhm.
So one kind of task is a task that just involves language. So rewriting, summarizing, optimizing
Mhm.
for SEO, headline generation, copy editing, all of these kind of things are basically tasks that operate purely on language. They don't rely on anything from the model itself. They
Right.
just use some kind of source document and they do something linguistically with it. I think those are very proper and useful early tasks, relatively low risk tasks to use these tools for. There's a whole other kind of task, which the term I use is a knowledge task, and that's
Right.
a task where you're asking the model to bring its own knowledge, from inside its training data or wherever it happens to be, and that's a much more problematic task because the risk of hallucination is much greater. It's not there's still a risk of hallucination in language tasks, but it's much smaller,
Mhm.
and it's much easier to edit. Whereas in knowledge tasks, you're dependent on a lot of things. You're dependent on the quality of the information that the language model has and its training. All of this stuff is in there, and that's very risky. And I
Mhm.
think what you've seen in these as you say, these gray slime examples, it's essentially knowledge tasks. And a big one
Right.
about a year ago was CNET, where they had
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
had articles that were written from scratch by these tools. There's a few other examples. I think those, in terms of sort of familiar brands like Sports Illustrated or CNET, those are essentially digitally native organizations. I mean, Sports Illustrated isn't, but they're mostly digitally native organizations that are kind of on the ropes because
Yeah.
of the collapse in advertising and referrals, and they're basically casting around for anything that they can do to stay afloat. And so, I have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, they're big catastrophic mistakes, but I have a little sympathy for why they're trying to do that, and they are providing lessons for the news industry generally. I think in the broader sense, not just news organizations using these tools for knowledge tasks to write articles and so on, but everybody, the whole ecosystem producing content. Um, I think the question there is actually not so much about the production as about the filters and the role of recommender systems and curation systems and so on
Mm.
that put this content in front of audiences. And the reason that's important is because, all of our experience of media, I think these days, is already full. Every waking minute that we have when we're not sort of forced to do something else is spent consuming media. Every
Mm.
little interstitial moment, every portion of our day is set up for consuming media. So if you've already got an infinity of media, basically, and 24 hours a day to consume it, then if you add another infinity on top of that from generative AI,
Hmm.
it doesn't really make that much of a difference unless it's got a quality or a capacity to get through the filters. And so I think the filters are where the action is in terms of the gray slime. If the gray slime, or if AI generated content is valuable, and if it's valuable enough to get through the filters,
Hmm.
well, then maybe that's okay. I don't think it is generally at the moment,
Yeah.
but at some point in the future, that might be fine. But it's the filters that make that
Yeah.
determination, right? If you're getting slime through your filter, that's a filter problem, and
I
this
like
is
that. Yeah.
the recommendation systems are at the heart of that.
That's good. I like that because it's kind of a semi optimistic take on that, I would think, which is that the filters can potentially still save us. Although one of our primary filters is Google, and I feel like Google has such an ambivalence here with regard to needing to serve up valuable content to people who use it search, but also being a player in the whole AI environment. And I feel like there's sort of a struggle there, that they're a balance, at least, that they're trying to achieve, and I'm not sure how well they're doing it.
Well, the sense I get is that Google has put a lot of work into the accuracy of their models.
Hmm.
They're nowhere near. They still hallucinate and they still have a lot of problems, of
For
course.
sure.
But they have a lot of work that they're putting in to try and to try to make those models a little better, and that's actually what maybe has hurt them a little bit, because it also makes those models a little more boring. Whereas,
Right.
OpenAI, they don't have this sort of legacy brand and all the rest of it, the search expectations, and they can be a little more kind of free and easy. Say with the early editions
Hmm.
of GPT, you actually even see this with the GPT models, GPT-4 and so on, becoming a little more boring and a little more accurate over time from release to release to release.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I have noticed that.
We're all on.
Although sometimes I ask it to spice things up a bit, so it's hard to tell. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of products and things that have emerged in the last few months. Actually, this one's fairly recent. I don't know if you're familiar with semaphore signals.
I am.
Yeah, so I really wanted to get your take on this because my view is that this seems like the first in a new era of applying generative AI to content, in that it looks like they've really thought about it and sort of figured out a human in the loop and sort of correct way to apply the technology, while still taking advantage of some of the inherent abilities of generative AI, with which is like, in this case, language, right? So it's supposedly scanning things on all kinds of languages to bring good information to their journalists. Something that was probably certainly possible before, but you needed to be a little more deliberate and a much more. It was much harder in general. So I'd love to get your take on what this represents and whether or not you think it might be pointing the way to better implementations of journalism and news production, or sorry,
Yeah.
generative AI news production.
Yeah, I think there's other examples of this as well. I mean, this is generally about using um, large language models for news gathering
Mm,
versus for generating, right? And so everybody
right,
looks,
right.
generative AI, the writing of articles or the writing of summaries or the production of images or videos, whatever, that gets all the attention. But then there's this other huge realm of opportunity for journalism, which is these tools can read. They can
Hmm.
read enormous amounts of text, and they can actually now look at images and pretty soon look at video and analyze that and describe that and summarize that and reduce that. And there's some very, very interesting examples in their early stages that I got an opportunity to work with last year that do these kind of things. There's one in particular um, that's being built by a publisher in Colombia called Question Publica. And they've built
Nice.
this very, very interesting system using a fine tuned LLM in which they have a big repository of structured data about essentially the elites in Colombian society, and they have this tool where they can read that with the LLM in response to new news. So some development happens in the news, and they can basically put that development, that new news, into their system. The system has read all of this vast amount of structured information they have about all of Colombian society, basically. Who's on whose board and who went to school with who and who's married to who and all this stuff, and they can basically interpret the new news in the context of that complex information and produce an analysis, right? And that's
Nice.
an example of the use that's an example of the use of these tools to read and contextualize and to analyze and kind of reduce. And that doesn't need to stop at any level. You could imagine a situation quite easily, um, in which everything that's available in public, every piece of text, every piece of audio, every piece of video, is analyzed and reduced that way. And in fact, you don't really have to imagine it, because that's kind of what generative search is, right? I
Right.
mean, Google are indexing and reading and incorporating all of this information. So that's something I think, talking earlier about this sort of longer term potential for journalism to be fundamentally restructured, in a few years because of this. This is one way, and this is one way that might be quite positive. I mean, an analogy here might be, what would you do if you had infinite reporters? If your
Mm.
news organization had enough reporters that they could read every single, court appearance and read every single press release and transcript and on and on and on. And, what would you do with that? Right. And that's
Mm.
kind of the question. Is there a form of journalism that can basically use this to dramatically expand what can be reported on, or even what could be considered news. Right? There's huge areas of our society that is really, it's not news because it's not feasible for it to be news.
Mm.
But that might be different now. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Well, look, we're talking a lot about these sort of bigger fundamental reshapings and what newsrooms can do. I'd love to bring things back to the ground level. What advice would you have here for journalists, sort of talking about individual reporters and editors here, who are just taking their first steps in AI? What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so there's a body of work that I'm ramping up on for the latter part of the year that's focused very much on this, and it's essentially um, about the nitty gritty details of a newsroom building this into their day to day operations.
Mm.
And I think the first thing at the very earliest stage, the first thing to do is to engage with the tools, and
Mm.
especially to engage with large language models. These are not things that you can learn about by reading. There's no best practices, although there's a million and one people on social media who will sell you a PDF about the 10 magic prompts that will
The
save your life.
ChatGPT cheat sheet.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's just no substitute for getting your your fingernails dirty and just sitting down and doing it yourself. And not just sort of doing it in terms of playing, although that's important, but doing it in terms of actual problems that you actually have in the newsroom. And there's a long, just sit down for 30 minutes and you'll have a long, long list of these. Play a little bit with the tools, and you'll have an even longer list of the things that you might be able to do with it. And pick one and solve it, and then pick another one and solve that. And I think just that active engagement is critical. More specifically, I think that if you look at what will last from the present era of our kind of our nascent steps into AI driven journalism, what will last 10 years from now, 20 years from now, however far in the future, I think that one of the things that will last is prompting. And I think there's a key moment that we're in right now, where a lot of prompts are disappearing behind buttons on user interfaces. And that's a problem for prompts that do journalistic tasks, because if you're outsourcing the prompt, for example, to a product team or to an engineering team or whatever it is, you're outsourcing the editorial intent and the editorial quality of the results at some level that come from that prompt. And so I think taking prompting very seriously, working hard at it, learning about the different techniques, learning how to define tasks and how to define quality criteria for tasks, how to evaluate tasks, how to iterate on prompts against quality criteria. All of these things, these are things that engaging with those and doing those for real projects is a real way forward. And you can do that, as a small news organization, you can do that and simultaneously, create substantial productivity gains all at the same time. These are not things that are going to take a lot of technical skills or years and years and years or millions and millions of dollars to do. These are things that non-technical people, with 4 or 8 hours a week or something, with a relatively tiny budget, can do just as easily as anybody else. So that's how I'd start. There's a little bit more that goes on, I think, to build these tools, especially in kind of mid-size or larger newsrooms, to build these tools into routine production. It's a little more complex to do that in routine, everyday publishing in a mid-size or large organization. It's a little more complicated than just sitting down at a ChatGPT interface. And so I think there's a set of additional, especially when you get into some of the more advanced projects and possibilities. And that includes infrastructure. I think there's requirements that once you sort of develop these and get more sophisticated, there's things that you kind of quite soon see that you need in a content management system, for example, or even in a serving system. When, for example, if you can produce 5 or 10 different variations on a piece of content, you need to be able to put the right piece of content in front of the right user at the right time. So things like segmenting your audience and being able to serve different pieces of content to different segments of audience, these things take on a kind of renewed importance. So there's like this sort of chain of steps. But those low parts of the chain, those early opportunities, they're basically accessible to anybody.
That's interesting. There's a lot of things I could touch on there, but the thing that I find very interesting is the idea that abstracting the prompt away entirely is a bad idea, because I do feel like that feels correct to me. Like, it feels that the medium, the balance you want is to retain that editorial control, but at the same time steer it in some way. So I feel like it's not the chatbots we have today or a generic ChatGPT interface, but it's also not a single button. There's something in between where there is some level of iteration and steering on the editor at the editor level. But the tool itself has been built to make sure that a certain there's some guardrails on that result, particularly with regard probably to hallucinations, but perhaps other things like the topic, et cetera.
Yeah, I think there's a long list of reasons why prompting should be an editorial task.
Hmm.
So definitely, having control over quality and all that, the kind of the obvious reasons are there, but there's also like longer term reasons. Um, a big one is we don't know where these models are going to go or the uses that we're going to be able to put them to. But to have agency, to have kind of control over that, we're going to have to know how to prompt them, right? It's
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
it's not going to be a good situation if you sort of default to pushing a button and editing the results, and then at some point, 2 or 5 or 10 years in the future, you suddenly realize that it's passed you by. You no longer have the ability
Hmm.
or the sophistication with the control of these models to
Well, I
take
also
full
feel like
advantage of them. Then
I feel
then
like
you've lost
yeah,
that. You don't get that back.
and I feel like journalists are kind of probably a lot of them anyway, probably naturally good at prompt engineering just because they're used to follow up questions, getting at the heart of something, and iterating essentially on a line of
Right.
inquiry
I, I
to
agree
get the
100.
information they want.
I agree 100%. I think it's and I've seen this again and again. I've worked with an awful lot of newsrooms of all sizes over the last year, and I think the big barrier is actually a confidence barrier. It's
Mm,
you basically see this pattern where people are initially hesitant. They initially have this sort of assumption that there's some kind of a technical task, and they look for technical. They try to mimic a coder basically, and then
right.
when they realize there's a point where a light bulb goes off where they realize what they're dealing with. They start to interact, as a almost as a person rather than as a thing. And they become confident. They learn to control the model and the output, and they can see the cause and effect. And it's all through language, which they're
Mm,
usually very very skilled at to start with. And so I just see that confidence as being the blocker, not the skills, not the budget, not even
yeah.
the time, but the confidence.
Well, let me ask you about another potential blocker, which is what I would call like the stigma of using AI, particularly in journalism. And so my sense is that from people that I talk to, various editors, journalists, there's still a certain amount of skepticism about its overall value. And I think that's waned over time as sort of ChatGPT has become more part of just culture. But there is some not just fear but scorn a little bit, maybe for lack of a better word, on maybe I don't know where it really comes from, whether they think it's going to take jobs or it's taking jobs or it's just cheapening what journalists do in some way, and it's probably partly because of some of those cases we talked about. But what can be done about that? Or is that even the right question? Maybe this is healthy. I don't know. But what I also want to just get what your sense is. Is that skepticism that sort of going away?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, one of the biggest surprises that I've had in the last year and a half with these tools is how little of that I've seen. Like, there's definitely some
Hmm.
of it, right? But given the stage that we're at with this, how early we are with this, and given how fundamentally it touches, a lot of what's pretty core to journalism, writing, for example. Given all that, I would have expected a much greater backlash against it. And I
Hmm.
look at social media and sort of the techlash against the search and social giants and so on as an example of that. But I haven't seen that. I see like little bits here and there and like individuals and all that, but I've been really surprised at how basically optimistic many newsrooms are. I mean, I know I have to admit here that I'm seeing a very sort of carefully
Yeah.
chosen slice of the news industry. So if they're talking to me, they're probably pretty AI forward to start with. But even so, inside those newsrooms, it's like this is a new era, and I want to be involved. How do I do that? That's the tone. I see that more. I work mostly with newsrooms in Europe, in the Nordic countries, and so on, and I see that more there. I think it's
Hmm.
maybe um, that optimism is maybe a little less in the U.S. For some reason that I can't quite put my finger on. But certainly in the Nordic countries, they're very optimistic and moving forward very confidently. And I also see the same in places like Germany and Austria and Switzerland.
So while I have generally have more of a sort of, I would say, somewhere between optimism and realism about the role of AI in journalism, one thing I do kind of worry about almost on a philosophical level is as maybe certain rote exercises get taken over by AI. But to get to the sort of what I worry about is sort of an atrophying of certain muscles. And the question that I sort of come to in a pragmatic way is like, what are the interns going to do? So like, what is that something we should worry about? I mean, again, sometimes I think about this optimistically. It's like, well, typing and typewriters and certain line taping stuff that went away and all those jobs went away. But, we still did stuff. But is there a certain amount of muscle memory as things like copy editing, just for example, or even social media managers, all these things that are starting to be taken over by generative AI? Are we losing something more? Or is this sort of a natural progression? What's your
Yeah.
take?
So this is kind of what I was referring to briefly earlier, where if you don't engage and exercise and really get your fingernails dirty with these tools,
Mm,
then at some future date, you'll lose a certain amount of agency. And I think what you're speaking about there is losing the current skills, losing the current tasks and the ability to do those well. And I think a lot of that is frankly not going to matter that much.
gotcha.
I
Mm,
think these tools are here to stay. They're on a trajectory that is improving their abilities very, very quickly. And I think there's a lot of tasks that we can quite safely give up. But we have to think about this same question from the perspective of 10 or 20 years from now. What are the tasks in this new world of models, of very powerful models, and the control of those models? What are the tasks that we want to have power over? And this is why I keep coming back to prompting at some level. Understanding how to control the models and feeling comfortable controlling the models. And again, this is not a technical task. This is an engagement task. Having that now will build whatever we're going to need. We don't know what it is. 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20
mm,
years from now. Staying engaged is that path to continued relevance. Whether or not we can copy edit or do things that interns do now, I don't think
mm,
that's as important. There probably are some things that we would want to retain, but I think most of it is probably going to change quite radically. Another place where you're seeing a similar set of questions being asked is education in academia, right? It's like, well, what
mm,
do we teach the kids now in a world where they're going to grow up with these tools, and
right.
it is different. You don't necessarily need to bring everything from the past forward.
So, just to wrap things up, I know we've touched on the future a lot, and no one is a crystal ball, but I'd like to sort of ask a question that I often ask of various folks I talk to, which is sort of projecting out to the 5-10 years we've been talking about. What does journalism look like in sort of an AI mediated world? But I think with you, like since we've touched on it a lot, like one thing we didn't spend a ton of time talking about was news consumption. And I know you've written about Artifact, and I used to write about it too. And I know it's no longer with us, but that idea of a more malleable reader experience, whether that's fueled by generative search or whatever Apple's got in store, and like certainly as these kind of AI powered assistants become more common, bringing news to us in whatever format that we can kind of think of. What does journalism look like in a world like that? What are the atoms of it? Is storytelling still relatively the same? What sort of world is it where AI is touching all parts of the process, but particularly the reaching the audience side? What do you
Yeah,
think?
on the consumption side, with Artifact and which is gone now, and other examples, I think the fundamental thing goes back to that difference between, or that separation between the semantic information and the way that it's expressed. And I think the way that it's expressed is under the control of the audience from now on. Basically,
Mhm.
it's going to take a little while to get there, but essentially, audiences are going to control how they consume information. They're going to control every last little aspect of that. If they want it as some kind of video or whatever it is, they're going to get that. Artifact was a baby step in that direction, but there's many others. Generative search itself is an example. So that core difference is behind that. so then you got to ask, I think, well, what's fundamental and what's permanent about that semantic information? There's a whole business model question about how you pay for collecting it, which is a little separate here. But what is it? Like, another way to think about it is, what should a newsroom produce 10 years from now, right? And I think there's some fundamentals there that we can rely on. I think story is a fundamental. I think story is kind of baked into the psychology and even the biology of being human. I think it's a fundamental at its very basis, it's a fundamental data structure that we use to organize our worlds. So I don't think story is going away. I think it'll still be here 10,000 years from now. That's not going to be something that's changing. I think there are things that we need to do around separating news, and by news I mean event-driven information, as distinct from kind of knowledge graphs, which are more kind of the nouns of the worlds and how they relate. I think there are things that we need to do with regard to data structures, even, or ways to organize that information. This might be things like breaking things down into their smallest facts, and being able to sort of validate those, or have a process, probably machine aided, to work with those kind of small units. I've done a lot of work in the past with structured forms of journalism. It's a little different now in a large language model environment, but some kind of an idea for what those kind of units are, much smaller than an article. Maybe they're events, maybe they're facts, maybe they're various interpretations. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in those. Those will probably be something like the output of newsrooms at some point in the future. There's no point in producing your news output as an article if that article is mostly going to be read by a machine to create an experience for a consumer. There are probably other ways to provide richer outputs. But what those are, I think we still have a lot of work to do to figure out that.
David, what is the one thing everyone in the media business or in journalism should know about generative AI?
I think the one thing that I'd reinforce is that this is not like the old school AI, which was about data science and deeply technical machine learning and data warehouses and all of that stuff. This is and that was very inaccessible. There was a kind of a priesthood that kind of ran that and all that. This new era that we're in is very different, and it's open to everybody. And I really mean everybody. You can use ChatGPT for free. You can pay $20 a month and get the best of it. These new Google tools, there's a lot of interesting things happening with Google's Gemini 1.5 model. They're really open-ended at the moment in the possibilities, but they're easy to get your hands on and to actually use, no matter what your technical skills are, your budget or whatnot. So that's the biggest thing is that this is open to you. There is no reason at all that you, everyone listening, cannot use this to automate tasks that you do every day or that are important to your newsroom. All you need to do is sit down, think through the task, get familiar with the tool, learn how to prompt a little bit, iterate, and it will happen. Get through that confidence barrier, and this whole new world will open up to you.
David, this has been great. Thank you so much for the conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Media Copilot. Please visit us at mediacopilot.ai to subscribe to our newsletter and check out the classes that we offer to journalists, marketers, and content creators. You can also follow us on Twitter at The Media Copilot. Be seeing you in the future.